Well, I hope you're all safe and doing okay. This is a lecture about the final exam from 2019, but just this particular video is only on the International Finance Diagram questions. So let's dive right in. I'll try to do this efficiently so it doesn't drag on too long, but there are, it's questions 30 to question 46, so that's quite a lot to do. The good news is that it's not that many comparative statics experiments. Usually there's several questions, one or two, two, maybe three questions on the exam about a given comparative statics question. So let's dive in. Question 30 on the 2019 final exam for economics 3080 is, in the long run, if the government budget deficit is larger, what happens? Okay, so first of all, that's a long run question. So let's draw the long run diagrams here. So we've got the supply and demand for loanable funds. Here we have investment plus CF on the axis, real interest rate up here. Here's CF as a function of capital flow as a function of the real interest rate. Investment as a function of the real interest rate. Of course, we have those on the axis. In the initial situation, we trace over this interest rate and find that's the quantity of capital flow. That's the quantity of investment. And then that quantity of capital flow there is the supply of dollars down here, where we have the real exchange rate on the axis and the quantity of net exports on the axis. Of course, net exports equals capital flow. That's an accounting identity, and the economic forces make net exports end up equaling intentional capital flow. Then the demand for dollars is just the net exports as a function of real exchange rate curve. So that's our curves. We have here an increase in the government budget deficit. So let's graph that in red. What is that? That is a reduction in national saving. Government budget deficit, the government's borrowing more, so the country as a whole is going to be saving less. It's pretty unlikely that the private sector saves as much more as the government is borrowing extra. That's theoretically possible, but not very likely. So I'm going to graph this as a shift back in the supply of loanable funds curve. That leads to a higher real interest rate. There's been no shift in capital flow or investment as a function of the interest rate. So all we have to do is just trace down the new levels. Quantity of investment prime, quantity of capital flow prime. The quantity of capital flow prime, which is a lower level of capital flow, implies a leftward shift in the supply of dollars. There's no cause for a change, no reason for a change or any shift in the demand for dollars, because just the government borrowing more money isn't going to change net exports as a function of the real exchange rate very much. So, but in any case, there's the new level of net exports, and here's the old level of net exports. And in terms of the exchange rate, there's the old real exchange rate, and here's the new real exchange rate. Okay, let's see how many questions we can answer this, and if I forgot something, I'll add that in. Okay, first, question 30, our answer categories are about physical investment and the real exchange rate. Physical investment goes down, real exchange rate goes up, and we've got the answer D on question 30 here. But question 31 asks about net exports and the real interest rate. What's happening to net exports and the real interest rate? Net exports go down, real interest rate goes up, and that you can see as answer D in question 31. And by the way, I advise you to print out or otherwise have handy the exam as you're watching this video. I won't try to show it that way. Just follow along with me in your own copy. Okay, new experiment in question 32. People get worried about the stability of the rest of the world outside the United States. This is called a risk-on situation. I mentioned it in a previous lecture, but without that word. A risk-on, what's going to happen? We're in the short run. So given that we're in the short run, I've got to draw a new short run graph, and I better do a new set of these so that what's going on with the red doesn't confuse us. Okay, so let's so short run means we've got the central bank, the Fed, determining a real interest rate. Okay, chooses a nominal interest rate, that determines a real interest rate. Now, again, these graphs are the same as before. So you've got, they don't look any different in the short run than in the long run. Quantity of capital flow, investment as a function of the real interest rate. That determines a quantity of investment. Now we go down here, our quantity of capital flow. Quantity of capital flow determines a supply of dollars that interacts with a demand for dollars, which is the same thing as net exports as a function of the real exchange rate. Do notice that this is real exchange rate on this axis, but up here it's all real interest rate. That's why we line these up so that the real interest rate level lines up. That's why we put these on top. This one's on the bottom because it has a different thing on the vertical axis, namely the real exchange rate. Okay, so that's our initial situation. We've got to think of the things look bad in the rest of the world. Now, they might look bad in the US, but people are even more worried about the rest of the world. So let's graph this as a black situation. So let's, okay, so what does risk on do? Folks want to send their funds to the United States, which seems a little bit safer than the rest of the world, even though it's scary everywhere. It's especially scary in the rest of the world. So an extra capital inflow at any given level of real interest rate is this leftward shift in capital flow. So I'm going to call that capital flow prime. And just remember, that's not a derivative, that's just an alternative curve. And we're going to treat the real interest rate as being kept the same. So the way I want you to analyze these short run questions are to start with the assumption that the Fed or other central bank is just keeping the real interest rate the same. If I want to ask you about which way might the central bank want to move its real interest rate, I will ask that quite explicitly. So assume it's keeping the real interest rate the same unless I tell you it's contemplating a change or doing a change. So with the same real interest rate, no change in investment, capital flow goes down. With the capital flow down, the supply of dollars goes down, and that raises the real exchange rate. So here's, just to be a little bit careful, there's the old level of the real exchange rate and the old level of net exports. The new level of the real exchange rate is higher. The new level of net exports is lower. Okay, now I think we're ready to look at the answer categories. So question 32 is asking about the real exchange rate and aggregate demand. So if we think about aggregate demand, that's something I didn't analyze yet, so I got to go back and add that in. The aggregate demand, remember what we had on this axis was, well, no, that's no help. Only in the long run would that be helpful. I've got for aggregate demand, remember I have consumption, investment, government purchases, net exports. Those are all components of aggregate demand. So I've got a plus because they add into aggregate demand, and aggregate demand equals GDP. Now you've got a positive feedback loop called the Keynesian cross there, but there's no initial impulse to consumption. It starts with investment in net exports. G is not going anywhere. There's no reason that would have changed, government purchases. So we just need to look at what's happening to the sum of investment in net exports. Notice that goes down. Investment same, net exports down. So this lowers aggregate demand, which lowers GDP, which lowers consumption. So you have some second and third round effects on consumption. But at any rate, this lower net exports that you can see here puts a process in motion that lowers aggregate demand. So what we've got is the real exchange rate went up and aggregate demand went down because of the decline in net exports and no other impulse to aggregate demand, just the positive feedback loop called the Keynesian cross. Sorry, not the Keynesian cross, called the Keynesian multiplier. Yeah, scratch that before when I called that the Keynesian cross. No, this positive feedback loop is the Keynesian multiplier. I should label that just to Keynesian multiplier. And Keynes was a very, very smart economist, very impressive guy. There's some biographies of him. Okay, so if I look at the answer categories, real exchange rate increases, but aggregate demand decreases. Up, real exchange rate, net exports going down, reduces aggregate demand, because I and G aren't doing anything, and C is only magnifying things, not changing the direction. Okay, let's look at question 33. Same situation, but the answer categories are quantity of physical investment and net capital outflow. And as you can see, net capital outflow went down. I didn't label that explicitly, but I will now. Quantity of capital flow went down. Investment stays the same. And so the A through D all have increases and decreases. Since we have no change in investment, we have to go to answer E. At least one of the quantity of physical investment in the net capital outflow, CF, stays unchanged, or the direction of movement of at least one is genuinely ambiguous. So you do sometimes have to use those answers on the exam that try to say, well, something other than one thing increasing and the other decreasing happened. You know, maybe ambiguity. In this case, it's not ambiguity, it's just no change. All right, we're two experiments down. Let's move on to the third. Third question, 34, on 2019 final exam. In the long run, if the central bank raises the growth rate of the money supply, and what happens? Ooh, boy. here, you know, you might think this is a trick answer, but what's going on is the principle that the central bank has no power over anything real, except maybe real money balances. But basically, the central bank has no power over anything real in the long run. So the key was the central bank doing something, and the fact that it was in the long run. So since it's in the long run, we're talking about a real model. So ignore the red here, but we're back in the long run international finance diagram. And except we don't have the red thing. In fact, we don't have anything changing. In the long run, the central bank can't shift any of these curves. You know, if you look closely at them, they've got real things on the axes. Okay, and I'll add the label there. All of these things are real things. None of them is something narrow like real money balances, and so Fed can't have any effect in the long run. So the answer is no change. So let's see what our answer categories are. We've got increase, decrease. We got to go to answer E. At least one stays unchanged, or the direction of movement is ambiguous, and so we go with answer E again. Now, and honestly, question 35, it's the same deal. The answer categories up top are in 34 were net exports and real exchange rate, no effect. Question 35, the answer categories were physical investment and real interest rate, no change. So in each case, we got to go to answer E. So actually, if you understood that the central bank cannot affect real things in the long run, those were actually relatively quick questions. Okay, let's move on to question 36. In the short run, if the Fed reduces its target interest rate, what happens? Let's take a look. So actually, I might as well leave that one the same. I need some new ones here so it doesn't get confusing. I'll try to be really fast. Got a little trigger happy there, wanting to draw investment. Okay, what's our experiment? I'll do this in green. This is a green situation. The Fed is reducing its target interest rate. Now, we could go all the way back to the supply and demand for the monetary base, but as long as you know that the Fed can choose the real interest rate here, that's we don't need, that's not going to help us any. If the Fed operates like it's operating now, it just has a large enough monetary base that interest on reserves is basically setting the real interest rate. So what we're talking about in the kind of way the Fed is doing things now is simply a lower interest on reserves, which leads to a lower market real interest rate that gives us a higher supply of dollars because of a higher quantity of capital flow. That lower real interest rate also gives us a higher level of investment. Now, I hadn't drawn the original level of investment, but I will do that now. Here's my original level of original quantity of investment. I think we're ready to look at the answer categories, and if we forgot anything, we'll figure it out. Question 36 is talking about real exchange rate and aggregate demand. Okay, so real exchange rate clearly goes up. What about aggregate demand? Just to remind you, C, I, G, and X all add into aggregate demand, which equals the GDP, and GDP is income that affects consumption. So let's see what we've got here. We've got a reduction in investment. Sorry, not a reduction, going to green, increase in investment. Notice, very easy to make stupid errors. So what I would recommend is you might get your studying done before then and get a good night's sleep before, because stupid errors are much more common when you don't get enough sleep. In general, our culture is gives way too much honor to people who get up early in the morning, lose sleep time to do stuff. It doesn't really make you more efficient. It makes you stupid to not get enough sleep. And so, and it may actually give you Alzheimer's to not get enough sleep too. There's a very interesting Peter Attia podcast about that. But I hope you respect sleep and get some good sleep before the exam. So, which means you got to really manage your time before then. Anyway, so I got plenty of sleep and I still made this mistake, but it makes it worse if you don't get enough sleep. So investment went up, and the capital flow, which equals net exports, went up. So we have net exports and net exports prime. So if both investment and net exports go up, G stays the same, but this gives you an increase in aggregate demand, and then the multiplier kicks in, Keynesian multiplier kicks in and gets you more consumption. So you definitely have more aggregate demand. So, in the answer categories, we've got the real exchange rate and aggregate demand. Real exchange rate decreases. I didn't actually draw that. There's the initial real exchange rate. Now here's the new real exchange rate. Of course, you don't actually have to draw all of these. If you get used to this, you can read off that you went from there to there. So real exchange rate decreased. But anyway, the answer category is the real exchange rate decreases, but aggregate demand increases because of I plus NX going up. Let's move on to question 37. Same situation, but the answer categories are same change. Both the answer categories are about physical investment and the quantity of net capital outflow. So that's I and CF. And as you can see, both of them go up because the interest rate goes down. After all, both of these are downward sloping curves. So both of them increase. That's answer A. Okay, we can move on to the next experiment. And I know I'm going through this fast, but I think you'll appreciate that. Okay, question 38. Suppose in the short run, people get worried about the stability of the rest of the world outside the United States, sometimes called risk on. What should the Fed do to get aggregate demand back to what it was before the shock? I'm trying to think let's see if we've got the relevant thing here. So here we've got, all right. So this was our risk-on situation, right? Now what we're doing is we're going on to think, well, what might the Fed want to do? And just to remind you, the investment stayed the same, but capital flow and therefore net exports went down. So we had a reduction in aggregate demand. We had a reduction in aggregate demand starting from this reduction in net exports. And so at that same real interest rate, which would be determined by having the same nominal interest rate, at that same real interest rate, aggregate demand has gone down. But the Fed's job is to keep, one of the Fed's jobs, and in arguably its biggest one, is to keep aggregate demand equal to the natural level of output. Natural level of output, let's assume here, has not changed because of the risk-on situation. And that's maybe I should have stated that assumption, but in any case, that's what I intended. The natural level of output hasn't changed. Oh no, it is clear that you're trying to get aggregate demand back to where it was. Aggregate demand went down because of this. So how do you increase aggregate demand? You cut interest rates. Okay, you cut interest rates. And of course, that's what we showed with the green. This was what I was saying here. You should ignore the green, but then you do this, and imagine this is the new capital flow as a function of the real interest rate curve. Anyway, aggregate demand went down, so you cut interest rates to get it back up. And that's the answer to 38. Okay, we're going to keep going at high speed here. Question 39. In the long run, if the government introduces a regulation requiring all employers to provide retirement savings accounts and have automatic enrollment with an 8% contribution rate, what will happen? Okay, so this is actually a shift out in the saving curve. So let me actually go back to this diagram here, but graph the shift out with a different color. So the shift back was the red. Now let's shift out the amount of saving. If you had a regulation where doing nothing, 8% of everybody's paycheck would get saved into a retirement savings account, I promise you a lot of people would save more money. And you've got a reading on that. So opposite direction, exactly opposite the red, will be the purple. And this will be kind of interesting to you. I'll do double primes here. This will be kind of interesting to you to see how it's exactly opposite. And okay, capital flow goes up. Investment goes up with the lower interest rate. Now this is not a lower, this is the long run. This is a long run, so the Fed doesn't control the real interest rate, but the real interest rate is falling because people want to save more, or want to is not quite the right word, but for any given interest rate, they are going to save more. Partly because it seems natural to do nothing and let the regulation, let the 8% out of their paycheck into retirement savings accounts happen. And not everybody will do that. Some people would say, put in the paperwork and say, I don't want to do that. But I promise you, many, many people would just leave it be. With the higher capital flow, you now have a supply of dollars double prime. Let's look at our answer categories here. Net exports and real exchange rate. Well, net exports went down. Net exports went up. Net exports double prime. Real exchange rate went down. Epsilon double prime. And that's our answer. Net exports increase while the real exchange rate decreases. Question 40 is the very same situation, but the answer categories are now quantity of physical investment and net capital outflow. And if you look carefully, you can see both of them increase. That's answer category A. Okay, now on to question 41. I've only got 20 minutes available to finish this, but I think we're on track. In the short run, if the government introduces a regulation requiring all employers to provide retirement savings accounts and have automatic enrollment, what will happen? So this is actually pretty interesting. So notice these curves, Well, let's take a look. Let's take a look. All right. I was going to preview it, but this is going to be, I think, a little bit surprising. Okay, so here we go. We're in the short run. So the Fed just has a fixed real interest rate. So again, that's determined by the Fed choosing a nominal interest rate, and then inflation has a lot of inertia to it. Inflation doesn't change very fast. All right, so we have an interest rate chosen by the Fed. Central bank chooses the real interest rate. Capital flow as a function of the real interest rate there. In investment as a function of the real interest rate. Oops. Quantity of capital flow then determines the supply of loanable funds. Demand for loanable funds is the same thing as net exports as a function of the real exchange rate. Well, we've seen that many times, but it's good to get practice in drawing these initial curves. And obviously getting practice in paying attention to the fact that it's the short run, not the long run. So now the government introduces a regulation requiring the retirement savings accounts. What happens? Well, what was the effect a minute ago of these retirement savings accounts? The effect was a shift out in the saving supply, the supply of loanable funds, or the saving curve, and that affected the real interest rate, and then things went on from there. But the Fed is pinning down the real interest rate here. So given that the Fed is pinning down the real interest rate in the short run, the fact that people are willing to save more for any given real interest rate has no effect in this diagram. Basically, you could view it as, in the short run, the Fed is kind of canceling out the effect on the real interest rate from the fact that people are willing to do more savings. So believe it or not, there is no effect, and that's the answer here in question 41. No effect. See, notice in this last year's final, I'm really trying to drill home the fact that in the long run, the Fed basically, actually this is kind of the converse of, in the long run, the Fed can't affect real things, but in the short run, the Fed has a lot of power of the real interest rate, and it can cancel out even a substantial change in the sort of propensity to save for any real interest rate. Okay, that's question 41. Let's move on to question 42. I think I'm going to make it. In the short run, this one has different answer categories, but again, nothing happens. So 41 and 42, you can see what the answer categories are, but basically nothing happens, and you answer that nothing happens in both 41 and 42 by giving answer E. Okay, let's move on to 43. We can start with this short run curve because it's another short run question, but in this case, we say what's going to happen if, in the US, if the European Central Bank raises its interest rate? What's going to happen? Well, let's think about that. European Central Bank raises its interest rate. Now, people are going to be more eager to invest, to send their funds, financial investment we're talking about, not physical investment. People will be more interested in sending their funds to Europe. That's a financial outflow from the United States. For any given real interest rate in the United States, there now will be more an outflow because of these funds going to Europe that has a higher interest rate. So the European Central Bank raising its real interest rate is a shift out in the capital curve. Again, not a derivative, just a new capital flow curve. The Fed is pinning down the real interest rate. The Fed will pin down the real interest rate, and if this were all that happened, then what would we be doing in terms of aggregate demand? C, I, G, and X, and again you've got those all contribute to aggregate demand. And then you got your Keynesian multiplier with that feedback loop. But you could see that because capital flow equals net exports, you're going to have a higher aggregate demand. So there's this starting point is net exports going up because there's more capital outflow. That raises aggregate demand. The question is saying, what could the Fed do to get U.S. aggregate demand back? If they did nothing, aggregate demand would go up. How do you bring aggregate demand back down? You have an increase in the interest rate. Raise its target rate is the answer. Okay, let's go on to question 44. In the long run, if the government raises tariffs, okay, let's do a graph of that. Here we go. In the long run, raise tariffs. What happens? In the long run, the government raises tariffs. I got to draw my long run graph of the supply and demand for loanable funds. Nothing new here in this initial situation. I'm just drawing the long run graphs. Quantity of investment, quantity of capital flow then becomes the supply of dollars, which interacts with the demand for dollars. Okay, what do tariffs do? Let's draw that in red. What tariffs do is for any given level of the real exchange rate, the tariffs make it so that we import less, and therefore net exports go up. Remember, net exports are exports minus imports. And so tariffs cause a rightward shift in the demand for dollars, because that's the same thing as the net exports as a function of the real interest rate. However, because the supply of dollars is vertical, there is no change whatsoever in the net exports in this simplified model. You know, there might, in the real world situation, there might be some, but probably not huge. But given that we've drawn this supply of dollars absolutely vertical, which you certainly should go with, that's what ManQ has, that's what we're going to do in this class. There's no change at all in the quantity of net exports. Net exports prime is the same as the original net exports. But the real exchange rate does go up. I drew that a little bit messily, but okay, let's look at our answer categories. In the first set of answer categories is quantity of physical investment and net capital outflow. Well, notice nothing is going on up top. So therefore, the financing, that is the loans available for buying net exports, haven't changed. Therefore, the quantity of net exports didn't change. But the financial stuff at the top didn't change. Therefore, the merchandise trade deficit or trade surplus also can't change. So you have to go with answer category E that has, you know, the possibility of some things not changing, because answers A through D involve things changing. And same with question 45, it's got things changing. Not a lot of things change except for the real exchange rate. And even though the real exchange rate is one of the things 45 asks about, the net exports don't change. And so you got to go with answer E that allows for the possibility of things staying the same. Okay, now, what if the government raises tariffs in the short run? Well, let's see if I can make this into a short run graph just by looking at that. Because after all, what's going on with the demand for net exports as a function of the real exchange rate, that is the same in the short run and the long run. So, you know, this curve, this curve, this curve, this curve, or, you know, before, after, those curves are have the same fundamental nature in the short run and the long run, not just the same fundamental nature, they're basically the same curves. And so I don't have to change anything over here, you know, no change in the real interest rate again, and no change in the quantity of funds available for loans to buy our net exports. Therefore, quantity of net exports doesn't change. Same change in the real exchange rate. But you got to go with answer category E, where things were allowed to not change, because all the other answer, A through D, all having something change. And that's it. And thank you so much for listening. And I hope I did a decent balance between going fast to save you time and to do it in the time I had available, and still being comprehensible. Fortunately, on a video like this, you can always go back and listen to a slice again if you had trouble. And thank you so much for rolling with the punches of how this class has turned out given the pandemic. And I'll do a couple more very soon on the rest of the exams. Bye.